In the vast stretches of the galaxy, a fragile peace had settled between two seemingly incompatible forces. The Galactic Empire, a conglomerate of authoritarian worlds bent on expanding its reach, and the Human Coalition, a relatively young and fiercely independent alliance of planets, had spent decades locked in a bitter Cold War. Yet, the galaxy, tired of constant conflict, craved respite, and so, after years of delicate negotiations, a historic truce was brokered. The human representatives had traveled to the neutral system of Viridian, the only place where neither side held absolute sway, to sign the treaty that would end the hostilities, at least for now. The treaty was simple but weighty. The Galactic Empire would halt its territorial expansion beyond the designated zones. Human colonies would be granted protection under the same treaties that safeguarded the Empire's territories. Trade routes, both vital and lucrative, would open for mutual benefit, with stringent clauses to prevent any form of subversion. And the penalties for breaching this agreement were severe: escalation into full-scale war, no less. Ryan Carter had been chosen as the Human Coalition's lead diplomat, a man whose reputation as a quiet, calculating force in the realm of negotiation was unparalleled. He was not a figure of military might or a symbol of propaganda, but rather one who had spent years understanding the political pulse of the galaxy, both in the shadows and in the glare of public light. His background and intelligence made him a master of strategy and nuance, and it was these skills that the Coalition needed now. No one doubted his ability to handle delicate matters of diplomacy with the Empire, nor his capacity to operate under pressure. However, this treaty would test him in ways no previous encounter had. For Carter, peace had always been the goal. His parents, once young revolutionaries, had witnessed the brutality of the Empire firsthand and had taught him the value of negotiation over violence. Growing up among the stars, Carter had seen the destruction wars left in their wake, the quiet suffering of civilian populations, the shattered lives of families. And yet, the Empire, with its towering warships and vast fleets, had always operated on the assumption that they could crush anyone who stood in their way. It had taken everything human ingenuity had to offer to hold the line, but now, finally, after decades of effort, there was the possibility, if only a slight one, that peace might be real. Carter's role had been to manage this tenuous peace, to oversee a treaty that balanced the pride of the Empire with the stubborn defiance of humankind. His job had been straightforward: negotiate, protect human interests, and ensure that the fragile peace held. For the first few months, things had gone as expected. There were trade agreements to broker, borders to establish, and 1,000 smaller decisions that kept the diplomats occupied. There had been talks of shared scientific efforts, military disengagements, and cultural exchanges. But beneath the surface, Carter knew something else was brewing. The first signs of the Empire's betrayal had been subtle. A human mining colony near the border had gone silent, its communication lines cut off without explanation. Initial reports suggested mechanical failure, but Carter knew better. He had dealt with the Empire long enough to recognize their tactics: saboteurs, assassins, and spies were part of their regular repertoire. The next incident came when a major human trade route was mysteriously blocked by an Empire warship, its crew claiming routine patrol under the pretense of security. The blockade lasted for days, disrupting critical supplies to several human planets. This was no accident, it was a deliberate provocation. A week later, a third breach occurred when an Empire fleet, operating under the guise of military drills, launched a series of unprovoked attacks on a human colony in the Valorn system. The strike had been swift, destructive, and coordinated. Key installations were targeted, and several civilians lost their lives. The Empire's response to this outrage was perfunctory, offering hollow apologies and promising investigations. But Carter knew there would be no real consequence. The Empire didn't care about the treaty. They were testing boundaries, and they would not stop until they had proven to themselves that humans had no power to stop them. Carter was summoned to the capital to discuss these violations. The human leadership, in their typical cautious manner, had hoped to resolve things quietly through diplomatic channels. But Carter's patience had worn thin. The breaches were no longer mistakes, they were acts of aggression. The Empire's leadership, with its arrogance and unyielding belief in its own superiority, had chosen to push the truce to its breaking point. Carter knew that this was no longer a matter of diplomacy, it was a matter of survival. When he arrived at the assembly hall on Althoria, the designated neutral moon for all high-level discussions, he could feel the tension in the air. The Empire's delegation was already present, a group of sleek, intimidating figures cloaked in the elegant garb of power. Among them was Lady Valeria, the Empire's chief envoy and the only one with the boldness to directly face Carter in these matters. The lady's reputation was legendary, calculating, ruthless, and unrelenting. Her gaze was sharp, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. She would not make the first move in this meeting, but Carter knew she would push every limit she could. Carter entered the room calmly, his demeanor one of restraint and focus. He had already prepared his opening statement, a sharp rebuke of the Empire's actions disguised as diplomatic language. He would not allow them to turn this into a spectacle of empty threats and counterclaims. He had come here for results, not for games. Lady Valeria, he began, his voice steady, the human coalition does not take breaches of this magnitude lightly. The Empire's actions, deliberate or not, are intolerable. You are well aware of the terms of the truce. You are well aware of the consequences. Lady Valeria's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Ambassador Carter, I'm sure you're aware that the Empire does not answer to such threats. We have nothing to prove, and the treaty, while momentarily inconvenient, is nothing more than a fleeting moment in the grand scope of the Empire's destiny. Carter's eyes narrowed. He had expected such a response, but it didn't change the reality he was about to create. The treaty is not negotiable. You have made your moves. And now, you will face the consequences. There will be no further negotiations. The Empire will either comply, or it will face the fury of humanity. Valeria's eyes flickered with something, amusement, perhaps, or contempt, but she said nothing more. The room was silent, as if the universe itself was waiting for Carter's next words. Despite the peace that had been signed in good faith, the Empire's true intentions began to surface, like a storm slowly gathering on the horizon. The first signs of trouble were subtle, too subtle for the average observer to notice. Trade disruptions, unusually long delays in convoy deliveries, the sudden disappearance of key diplomatic messages. But Carter knew these were not mere accidents. This was the Empire testing the waters, pushing the boundaries of the fragile truce, and Carter had been trained to spot the signs. The first breach came when a series of human trade vessels were mysteriously attacked just outside the borders of a newly established zone. The Imperial Navy, citing unintentional fire during routine military exercises, claimed responsibility for the skirmish. The damage, however, was severe, vital supplies were destroyed, and a few lives were lost. Carter was immediately called to the negotiating table to address what was being presented as an isolated incident. But Carter understood the game all too well. This wasn't a mistake, it was a deliberate provocation. The Imperial Ambassador, Lady Valeria, seemed perfectly poised in their meeting, all polished smiles and careful words. She conveyed an air of confidence, perhaps even arrogance, that made Carter uneasy. The Empire, she claimed, had merely misunderstood the neutral zones, and the attack on the trade convoy was unfortunate. But Carter's instincts screamed otherwise. This was no misunderstanding, this was the beginning of something far worse. Lady Valeria's assurance that the Empire would take full responsibility did nothing to ease the tension. She offered a few perfunctory apologies, but the underlying message was clear: humans were not the Empire's equals, and the treaty was only a temporary inconvenience. The Empire would push, and humans, they believed, would eventually bend. Carter pressed further. His questions were laced with subtle threats, his calm demeanor hiding the fury simmering beneath. You're suggesting that Imperial vessels strayed from the prescribed routes? Carter's voice remained level, but each word was calculated, designed to keep the pressure mounting. Is it not strange that this misunderstanding occurred just when human trade routes were most vulnerable? Lady Valeria smiled faintly, the smile of someone who had been playing this game far longer than Carter. Ambassador Carter, she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "You're suggesting that the Empire would deliberately violate the terms of our agreement? That would be unthinkable. These are just unfortunate coincidences." Carter's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. He didn't buy it, not for a second. The Empire was testing them, probing for weaknesses, seeing how far they could push the coalition without provoking full-scale retaliation. If they could get away with these accidents, the next step would be far more dangerous. He needed to act before the Empire's arrogance escalated further. The conversation continued, but Carter's mind was no longer focused on the polite back and forth. He was already thinking several moves ahead. If the Empire believed they could violate the treaty with impunity, they were gravely mistaken. The human coalition may not have the vast fleets of the Empire, but it had something far more dangerous: resolve and ingenuity. As the meeting wound down, Carter stood, extending his hand for the traditional diplomatic farewell. "I trust that the Empire will take swift action to prevent further misunderstandings," he said, his voice icy, but calm. Lady Valeria's smile remained in place, though it faltered slightly. "Of course, Ambassador. Rest assured, we will investigate the matter thoroughly." But as Carter walked away from the meeting, his mind was already working furiously. He knew the Empire would not back down without a fight. The question was, how far would they push? And more importantly, how far could he push back without starting a war? Within hours, Carter was back in his quarters, drafting a series of carefully worded communications. The message would go out to key members of the Human Coalition's leadership, informing them of the latest breach and laying out his proposed response. But he knew that words alone would not be enough. The Empire needed to understand that any further provocation would be met with consequences that would change the course of galactic history. Over the following days, Carter worked in the shadows, subtly contacting allies within the coalition, building a network of support without alerting the Empire to his true intentions. It was time to send a message, not through grand speeches or hollow threats, but through action. But it had to be precise, deliberate. A direct confrontation with the Empire would play into their hands. Instead, Carter would use the Empire's own arrogance against them. The first move came not from the coalition's military forces, but from the most unexpected of sources: the civilian trade routes. The Empire, believing the human response would be slow and disorganized, failed to anticipate Carter's plan. While Imperial forces were distracted by minor skirmishes along the outer rim, Carter had quietly orchestrated a series of attacks on the most critical Imperial supply lines, sabotages that would not only cripple the Empire's logistics but send a clear message that the Human Coalition would not stand idly by. At first, the Empire dismissed these attacks as nothing more than the work of rebellious factions or pirates. But as more supply lines were hit, it became clear that these were no random acts of sabotage. Someone was targeting their most vulnerable spots, and the Empire's intelligence network was failing to stop it. Carter had already calculated every move, every possible outcome. The coalition, operating on the periphery of Imperial space, could bleed the Empire dry without ever needing to engage in open warfare. Lady Valeria, upon learning of the new developments, was furious. She knew the Empire had made a grave mistake in underestimating the humans. And as she communicated the latest intelligence to Emperor Tiburon V, she could sense that their carefully crafted peace was slipping through their fingers. But Carter was already 10 steps ahead, his calm resolve now the sharpest weapon in the coalition's arsenal. In the quiet of his office, as the stars drifted lazily by, Carter allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He had set his trap, and now the Empire would have to decide: back down and honor the truce, or escalate and risk losing everything. But one thing was certain: Carter would not let them break the peace without a relentless response. The war, if it came, would not be fought on their terms. It would be fought on his. The tension had reached its breaking point. For weeks, Carter had sent diplomatic missives, warnings, and proposals for reparations. He'd used every diplomatic channel available, each message filled with veiled threats of retaliation, should the Empire's violations continue. And yet, all his efforts had been met with the same dismissive tone. The Empire wasn't worried. They believed that they could break the truce with impunity, that the human colonies were too fragmented and disorganized to offer a true response. But Carter knew better. The tipping point came when Imperial forces attacked another human colony, this time under the guise of enforcing a supposed Imperial security measure to quash what they called insurrectionist movements among human settlers. The attack, as usual, was cloaked in lies. Imperial forces had launched a full-scale bombardment of a civilian outpost, leaving half the colony in ruins. Over 1,000 human lives were lost, and entire families were wiped out in the blink of an eye. This wasn't a tactical strike, it was pure aggression. And this time, there would be no half-hearted response. Carter immediately ordered a full review of every option available. There would be no more negotiation, no more waiting for the Empire to return to the table. For all their arrogance, the Empire had vastly underestimated one thing: humanity's ability to endure and fight back. Carter would make them feel the weight of the mistake they had just made. He gathered his closest advisors, the best minds from both the military and intelligence sectors. Together, they formed a plan that would take the Empire's arrogance and turn it into its greatest liability. Carter had already prepared the groundwork. Under the cover of diplomatic immunity, he'd been quietly gathering intelligence, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to act. The Empire had underestimated the resolve of humans to defend their own. The first step in Carter's response was to counter the propaganda that the Empire had so successfully spread. It wasn't enough to strike militarily, Carter needed to dismantle the very foundation of the Empire's superiority complex. He called for a broadcast to all human colonies, an emergency address. In it, he exposed the full extent of the Empire's treachery. He revealed the false flag attacks, the sabotage of trade routes, and the brutal bombardment of civilian targets, which had been covered up as security operations. He made sure to include the specific coordinates of the destroyed colonies, the names of those who had died, and the unmistakable proof that the Empire had broken the truce. But Carter didn't stop there. The broadcast wasn't just for human ears, it was meant for the Empire, too. It was a declaration of intent, but more importantly, it was a declaration of humanity's strength. In the message, Carter made it clear, humanity would not be pushed into submission. The Empire's dominance, which they believed was unchallenged, was now in jeopardy. And for the first time, the Empire's own subjects, who had long been kept in line by fear and propaganda, began to hear the truth. As the message went live, Carter's plan unfolded in the shadows. Human intelligence operatives, working in secret across Imperial space, began to intercept Imperial communications and subtly feed disinformation. While the Empire's leaders were distracted by the broadcast, Carter unleashed a series of coordinated, covert strikes. These weren't full-scale military operations. No, Carter was far too precise for that. These were calculated operations meant to exploit the Empire's weakest points: communications, supply lines, and internal dissent. Meanwhile, Carter had activated a back channel with the leaders of the lesser-known Imperial sectors. Over the years, he had made numerous, quiet alliances with those who had grown disillusioned with the Empire's iron grip. These alliances weren't formed through military force, but through understanding, shared ideals, and the promise of a better future. These were leaders who saw the Empire for what it truly was: a bloated, decaying system that oppressed its people in the name of expansion and control. Carter's message to these leaders was simple: stand with humanity. Together, they could bring the Empire to its knees. Carter promised them autonomy, a seat at the table of the future, a future where the people would have a voice, where tyranny would be dismantled piece by piece. The impact was immediate. At first, there were whispers of rebellion within the Empire, hushed conversations between disgruntled officers and diplomats. Then came the first signs of defection. Imperial warships, once proud symbols of the Empire's might, were now leaving their posts, surrendering to human forces or, in some cases, joining the rebellion outright. The Empire's military began to fracture from within, as commanders, who had once sworn loyalty to Emperor Tiburon V, now questioned the validity of his rule. Carter had known this would happen. He had played the long game, and the results were now clear. The human response had shattered the Empire's veneer of invulnerability. What had once been a mighty force now faced insurrection not just from humans, but from within its own ranks. It was a masterstroke. Carter had turned the tables, using the Empire's own arrogance and overreach against it. He had unleashed humanity's fury, not through brute force, but through strategy, precision, and diplomacy. And now, with the Empire on the verge of collapse, Carter knew that the final phase of the plan was imminent. The fragile peace was no longer an option, this was a fight for the future, and Carter had just ignited the fire that would burn the Empire to the ground. With the Empire's forces now divided and vulnerable, Carter's next move would be decisive. It wasn't a matter of victory, it was a matter of securing humanity's place in the galaxy. The message had been sent. And now, the universe would know the true power of a human diplomat when pushed too far. The moment had come to enact the final phase of Carter's strategy. The Empire had pushed him too far, underestimated human resilience, and now it was time to remind them of their grievous error. Carter had already ensured that the human fleet was positioned across the galaxy in a series of strategic points, hidden beneath layers of encryption and redirection. Their location was unknown to the Empire, and that was precisely how Carter had planned it. He had made sure that the Empire's spies were watching the wrong signals, tracking irrelevant data, all while he prepared for the greatest diplomatic coup the galaxy had ever seen. Carter's first move was to flood the Imperial communication channels with carefully crafted transmissions, subtle messages that planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the Empire's officers. He broadcasted encrypted data revealing classified reports of high-ranking Imperial officials secretly meeting with human allies, forging their own covert deals that violated the very treaty the Empire had signed. The whispers of betrayal began to echo through the Empire's ranks, and Carter made sure to feed the rumors, both through leaks in Imperial media and private conversations with key Imperial diplomats, until distrust spread like wildfire. His message was clear: the Empire's leaders were already preparing for the collapse of the Truce, seeking to distance themselves from the treachery that was taking place within their own government. But Carter didn't stop there. He knew that the Empire's military might, for all its power, was ultimately built on a brittle foundation of arrogance. The same arrogance that had led to their underestimation of human strength. Carter sent encrypted signals to his allies within the Imperial fleet, secret sympathizers who had once been human defectors, now ingrained in Imperial service. He didn't need them to revolt, he just needed them to create enough confusion to stymie the Empire's strategic movements. By the time the Empire realized it, their own fleet would be caught in a tangled web of misinformation, leading to hesitation and disarray. Simultaneously, Carter launched a series of calculated raids on the Empire's supply lines, not with overwhelming force, but with precision. Small, well-coordinated strikes on Imperial logistical hubs, nothing too grand to provoke an all-out retaliation, but enough to send a message that the Empire's reach was no longer as untouchable as they believed. The Empire was a machine of immense power, but that machine relied on coordination, communication, and flawless execution. And Carter had disrupted every single one of those pillars. As chaos rippled through Imperial ranks, Carter turned his attention to the heart of the Empire, the Emperor himself. He had no desire for bloodshed or military confrontation, but he did want to force a shift in the balance of power. Carter made his move public. He sent a bold broadcast, not through the usual diplomatic channels but directly into the heart of Imperial-controlled space, to the very capital itself. The message, encrypted with layers of codes only the highest Imperial echelons could decipher, began simply. Your Excellency, Emperor Tiburon V. It seems your trust in your own strength has blinded you to the realities of our universe. You thought the human spirit could be broken, and in that, you have failed. What you do not understand is that, unlike your empire, we do not bow. We do not yield. And we will never forget the price of betrayal. It was a diplomatic declaration of war, without actually declaring war. A direct challenge to the emperor's authority, crafted in a way that made it impossible to dismiss as empty rhetoric. This was not a plea for peace or a cry for help, it was a statement of undeniable truth. Carter made sure the broadcast reached every corner of the Empire, each broadcast carrying with it the weight of humanity's defiance. The message rippled through Imperial politics like an earthquake. There was no ignoring it, no sweeping it under the rug. For the first time, the Empire's might was questioned, not by military force, but by a single man's words, backed by the silent, unseen power of an entire civilization that had been underestimated for too long. The message echoed through the capital, reverberating from the Imperial Palace to the corridors of the military command. Emperor Tiburon V, for all his power and pride, could not ignore this challenge. It was not just a human diplomat making demands, it was a civilization daring to reclaim its autonomy and, more importantly, its respect. Carter watched from the sidelines as the Empire's internal structures began to crack. First, it was the military. A few generals, initially wary of openly defying their emperor, slowly began to question the emperor's decisions. The diplomatic community was the next target, as more and more envoys began to express doubts about the stability of the empire's leadership. Carter's move had done what no fleet or weapon could accomplish: it had shattered the empire's invulnerability. The empire, once so confident, now faced an existential crisis. The emperor, who had long viewed the human race as nothing more than a footnote in the grand history of the galaxy, was now forced to confront the reality of the situation. Humanity had not only survived, they had thrived. They had turned the tables on the Empire, using diplomacy, strategy, and intelligence as their weapons. The Empire, despite its vast military might, could do nothing but watch as its own internal systems faltered. And yet, Carter knew this was only the beginning. The Empire would respond, that much was certain. But the next steps would be his to decide. The ball was now firmly in the Empire's court, and Carter was prepared for whatever came next. Whether through further manipulation of Imperial factions, or the eventual rise of a human fleet that had been silently biding its time, Carter had made one thing clear: humanity would never be cowed. The Galactic Empire, for all its power, had underestimated the one thing that made humans truly dangerous: their relentless fury when cornered.